The world's leading economies gathered in South Africa this week, pledging to work together to tackle the biggest challenges. The world's biggest player was a no-show. While the host nation brushed off the US boycott of the G20 summit, how much was really accomplished? I'm Hazem Sika, and this is the Newsmakers. It was a chance for South Africa to flex its diplomatic muscle on the world stage as the first African host of this year's G20 summit. But the world's biggest economy was conspicuous by its absence for the first time in the group's 26-year history. US President Donald Trump boycotting the summit in Johannesburg on the unfounded allegations South Africa's black majority government persecutes its white minority. Despite that, South Africa's President Cyril Ramaphosa got a declaration through to tackle climate change and economic inequality.
A first for the African continent, and a measure of the world's ability to work together at a moment of deep global strain. South Africa hosted this year's G20, opening the summit with an unusual step by adopting its declaration on day one. A clear signal of the priorities Pretoria wanted on the table from the outset. The declaration outlined commitments to pursue just and lasting peace in Ukraine, Sudan, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and the occupied Palestinian territories. It also calls for stronger support to vulnerable nations facing climate-driven disasters and relief for developing economies burdened by soaring debt. It additionally highlights critical minerals as an engine for value-added growth, a priority South Africa advanced throughout the year.
The adoption of the declaration from the summit sends an important signal to the world that multilateralism can and does deliver. It sends a message of hope and solidarity across the world. It tells the world that as the leaders of the G20, we will keep fast to our solemn pledge to leave no person, no community, and no country behind.
For African officials, this was a moment to push development financing, adaptation, and clean energy transitions higher up the global agenda, as debt levels in many poorer nations reach record highs. Those priorities also produced concrete outcomes, including a new EU-South Africa minerals partnership aimed at securing key supply chains. But the gathering unfolded under an unusual shadow. The United States, a founding G20 member and the group's next president, was absent. Washington boycotted the summit over allegations that South Africa mistreats its white minority, claims the government and independent monitors reject. Its absence reshaped the diplomatic tone, even if it didn't halt the proceedings. For many delegations, the question was less whether the G20 could function without the US, and more how decisions here would land as global influence becomes more widely distributed.
This year's G20 summit brought together nations representing 3/4 of the world's population, 2/3 of global GDP, and 3/4 of the world's trade. And that's without the United States formally attending. It's a reminder that the center of gravity in the global economy is shifting.
Carney's comments reflected a wider sentiment circulating through the summit. Discussions moved forward, but with clear frustration over the timing and optics of Washington's absence.
I think at the end of the day, not being here also opens them up for levels of vulnerability, but it also signals that by doing what they have done, they've now opened the door to that kind of behavior. And I think the frustration from some of the G20 leaders was that we will not be disrespected in this way. And then therefore, I think the fact that the US is not here doesn't mean they become irrelevant, but it means that the world still carries on without them.
And it did. Through a series of side meetings, countries advanced discussions on minerals, supply chains, financial reform, and the war in Ukraine.
The summit is therefore closed.
The Johannesburg summit ended with its declaration secured and a year of priorities carried through to completion. The work now moves forward and the challenges confronting the G20 remain as pressing as ever.
Well, joining me now from Beijing, Senior Research Fellow at the Center for China and Globalization, Andy Mock. And from Washington, D.C., we have Senior Fellow and Director of the Future of DHS Project at the Atlantic Council, Thomas Warrick. Good to have you both with us. And we did try to bring on Editor-in-Chief of City Press in South Africa, Mondli Makhanya, but have so far been unable to. We will bring him on if we manage to establish a connection. Good to have you both with us, gentlemen. Andy Mock, let me start with you. A lot's been said about the fact that US President Donald Trump snubbed this particular G20 summit, but the leaders plowed on and got a declaration out there. What do you take from this summit then? What's the headline for you?
Well, thanks for having me on, Hasim. I think the headline is the world is moving on. The U.S. as the world's largest economy in nominal terms, is obviously very important politically, militarily, still exerts a lot of influence. But I think the trend is unmistakable that the U.S. is withdrawing at the same time. Other countries are rising, not just China, but many countries around the world. And I think this latest incident is really just one in a series of events demonstrating this trend that many believe is irreversible.
Thomas Warrick, let me get your take on this. I want to ask you as well about the accusation that the Trump administration made that their reason for this boycott was what they refer to as white genocide, this claim, which has been categorically debunked, that the majority government, the black majority government in South Africa has been persecuting the white minority. Is that a smokescreen for the real reason? Because it's been suggested that the real reason is because of Ramaphosa taking Israel to court in the ICC.
Well, it's good to be with you and your fellow guest and your viewers. So there are a series of issues dividing the United States and South Africa. And you're right that claims of white genocide don't appear to be supported by facts on the ground. It actually has relatively little to do with the International Criminal Court and more with the attitude of the respective governments on a whole range of important issues. And that includes the environment, the economy, and the fact that President Trump has views that a great many other governments just do not share, and his ability to persuade others to his point of view. Obviously, when the United States doesn't show up at an event like the G20, there's less of an opportunity to try to change minds. So, as you say, the rest of the world is going off in a different direction. But people also understand that if the Democrats regain the White House, this will all flip back. And so this is a policy not of the United States of America and the American people, but rather of the Republican Party whenever they control the White House.
So Andy Mock, let me turn back to you on this. Has the U.S. and, of course, by extension, Donald Trump gifted a leadership opportunity here to China and to India as well?
Well, I think Thomas makes a great point that when the U.S. is not there, it certainly can't engage in dialogue or advance at least its rhetorical agenda. But I do want to add that the view from Beijing political analysts is that President Trump's statements about South Africa really are directed towards a domestic audience, and this reflects not just the Trump or the Republican position on this, but I think again, from the view from China, is that we're witnessing an emerging fault line within the Republican Party itself. Along the lines of, I think, what in the U.S. is termed anti-Semitism, with people like Nick Fuentes becoming increasingly influential. And on the same time, we have people like Senator Lindsey Graham, who describes himself as the Nazi suck wing of the Republican Party. And I think what this also means on the global stage is the US is likely to become even less effective, not just because of a policy decision taken by the Trump administration, but from internal divisions, not between the two parties, but within a particular party itself, which happens to be the ruling party right now.
Yeah, let me ask you about your take on that, Thomas Warrick. I mean, to what extent are the internal divisions within the Republican Party having an influence on all of this?
Well, under the U.S. Constitution, President Trump would not be able to run for another term as president. And so many Republicans are starting to look ahead, not at the upcoming elections in a year, but what will happen in the 2028 presidential election. So many of them are now taking more independent positions, for example, criticizing President Trump over his policy towards the Ukraine-Russia war and other issues as well. But on climate change, the Republican Party has traditionally favored the use of fossil fuels. And as we saw both in the climate change talks in Brazil as well as at the G20 summit, where climate change issues were very prominent on the agenda, you've got about half of the American public who just doesn't see that as an important issue, even while the other half of the American public sees it as an extremely important issue and very much agrees with the position of many countries around the world that these problems need to be addressed. And the best way to do that is through multilateral action.
Andy Mock, as far as the declaration itself and what came out of that, do you think there are some tangible things there? Because many of these summits, and the G20 is no exception, are often dismissed as just big talking shops where nothing really gets done. What do you say to that?
I think that's a fair point, but I think intention has to precede action. And certainly, we've seen here again, some might call this the G19 or the G Global South, certainly demonstrates the ability of 19 countries, perhaps with the exception of Argentina in this case, to work together. And I think this is a necessary precondition for actual concrete action. And again, we have to see whether there is follow through. But I think from the Chinese perspective, China shows up. It sees itself as a very responsible party, offering stability, providing an increasing menu of global goods. So not just investment in physical infrastructure, but increasingly offering digital infrastructure as well as turning AI into a public good by making many of its most advanced AI models open source instead of proprietary. So, again, I think that there's certainly promise here, even though I think the point is well taken that these types of get-togethers are largely rhetorical.
Thomas Warrick, what do you take from what was announced at this summit? And is there a sense that the U.S. is being left behind in all of this?
Well, the real thing to watch, to build on what Andy has said, is how governments spend their money. And in particular, there's always been a question in Washington whether China, as one of the world's largest economies, was going to commit to reductions in greenhouse gas emissions and a number of other kinds of measures. China invests, it trades, and so that gives it a degree of influence, but it's the influence of a customer. In other words, it buys enormous amounts of energy to fuel its economy. It buys minerals for manufacturing and production, where the United States and Europe have largely moved into the service sector, preferring to outsource manufacturing to other countries. All of this shows how the global economy is changing. It's a complete toss-up how artificial intelligence is going to influence that. I don't think anyone really knows how this is going to end up. But in terms of the global economy, you're going to see, obviously, greater prosperity from Africa over the next 20 years. That will have enormous effects on the lives of billions of people. And that will largely be done by Africans, not by either China or the United States.
So, Andy Mock, given the U.S.'s absence in this, the fact remains it is still the world's biggest economy, and in that respect, it still has a huge influence on the decisions that get made going forward. But to what extent is that a factor in how the global South, as we've been calling it, moves forward from this?
Well, I think a lot depends on American policy decisions, because while in nominal terms it still is the world's largest economy, which countries account for global growth is very, very different. So I think that's one thing we have to keep in mind. And if the U.S. continues to isolate itself from a trade and investment perspective, how big its domestic economy might become irrelevant for the rest of the world if there's no opportunities to buy and sell with it. So I think that's a big question to be determined. So we have to see. Certainly, the rest of the world, is moving on. China is taking the exact opposite tact that the U.S. is. It's opening up to talent through its K visas, welcoming young people with science and technology backgrounds, even if they don't have a job, to come to China. China's offering a more favorable trade environment to African countries, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I think in a way we're witnessing a real world policy A/B test here, right? So the U.S. is taking a much more go it alone stance. China is taking the exact opposite approach by integrating with the world in all the ways that the U.S. is seeking to cut itself off from the rest of the world.
Thomas Warrick, was this a precedent-setting moment for the U.S., or could this be just a one-off, given the fact as well that the U.S. will be hosting the summit next year?
Well, I'll give you an answer in 3 years when we know who is going to be controlling the White House in 2029. It's quite possible this will simply be seen as a 4-year aberration and then a return to normal trends. I think that the G20 summit in the United States is obviously going to be a showcase for Donald Trump and his views on enormously important issues on the world stage. Some countries share those views on climate and other things. Many people do not. You can expect there will be a focus on migration of peoples around the world. You can expect there will be an emphasis that countries need to do more on border security. So it'll be a different agenda. The issues will be important. And I think we will see over time whether the last year is the start of a new trend or whether it's simply something that goes up and down and stays closer to what is a global viewpoint.
And Andy Mock, one of the issues that is, of course, in the news the last couple of days is the war in Ukraine and this new peace proposal that's being put forward that seems on the face of it very favorable to Russia. And this gets into the question of the way the U.S. under Trump sees the world right now in terms of spheres of influence, in this lack of interest in events in Europe, in which the U.S. is now more focused on the Americas and the Indo-Pacific and trying to counter China's growing influence. Is that how you see it?
Well, I sort of think that's part of the picture, and it seems very clear that the Trump administration is looking to defend the American backyard, as it were. But at the same time, we have to look at the Trump administration's efforts in resolving the Middle East conflict and has made important progress there. Again, you mentioned the Ukraine conflict, and I think the Chinese view on this has always been that any conflict should be resolved through dialogue. But in this particular geographical problem, I think China's position also has been that you cannot have European security, a durable European security, without taking account of legitimate Russian security interest. And part of the problem has been that there has been in the European and the American view historically that no Russian security interest is legitimate. So, I think, again, we have to see. Certainly, it looks like Ukraine will give up significant territory, may end up being just a buffer state between Russia and the rest of Europe. And this is certainly not going to go down well with the Ukrainians. But perhaps resolving a military conflict with all of the tragic loss of human life and all the economic disruption will be a good thing.
Let's get your take on this then, Thomas Warrick. Should all this be seen as a wake-up call to Europe, that this is another reminder that it really needs to get its house in order as far as confronting Russia and dealing with many of these problems without the direct U.S. assistance?
Or with a different kind of U.S. assistance. Certainly, the initial draft of the 28-point plan for Ukraine has already been significantly reversed in the last few hours. Those of us watching carefully what Secretary of State Rubio has said, it's fairly clear that in some respects the position has flipped. What you're seeing is President Trump's desire to be a peacemaker on the world stage and find some solution that would end the war. But part of his core philosophy is that the European nations are rich and successful and need to be doing more for their own defense and not counting on the U.S. taxpayer to pay that burden. That will probably be a lasting legacy of the Trump administration, that Europe needs to do more for its own defense. And as Andy said, I think there's an abiding Trump administration interest in trying to end the conflicts of the Middle East. And in Asia, we're about to see a new national security strategy and a national defense strategy that is going to focus on the Western Hemisphere in ways we haven't seen for many years, but also is very concerned about China's threatening moves against the island of Taiwan. And so the United States is not abandoning its position on the world stage. I think the principal actor, President Trump, is just delivering his lines in a very different way from what has gone on before him.
All right. If I could just bring the discussion back briefly in the time we've got left to one of the issues that was dealt with in Johannesburg, which was led by the South African president, is this need to address global inequality, and particularly the situation that many African countries are dealing with in terms of debt. What's your take on that, Andy Mark?
Well, I think, certainly this is not a new problem, and it's an acute one in many ways. And I think this is something that China is very sensitive to, because, China is both a developed country, in some sense, a leading country economically from a technology perspective, from a diplomatic perspective, increasingly. But at the same time, it is still a developing country. And I'll just give you a couple quick examples. I was just in Northeast China in some of the rural areas, visiting some of the farms there. I was in Ningxia looking at some of the underdeveloped areas there as well. So there's still a lot that needs to be done in China. So, and I think what that gives China is a very empathetic sense of the challenges facing Africa. And I think that is one reason there has been such alignment between China and Africa, as well as other parts of the global South, not over just years, but decades.
So, Thomas Warrick, how do you think the world should be dealing with this whole issue of global inequality, particularly with the focus on Africa?
Well, one of the things that's fundamentally different is the Trump administration does not buy into what used to be called the international development agenda. It believes in investment and trade, just as China does, but sees it in a different way. So under President Trump, there is clearly going to be a substantial reduction of development assistance. Instead, the view is that the private sector, not state-owned enterprises, the private sector is better able to provide jobs, prosperity, and security. There are obviously instances where military force will be at the front of the line. But in many respects, what I think the Trump administration wants is to convert it from a discussion about development to one of trade and investment.
All right, and on that, we are going to leave it there. Thank you to both of our guests, Andy Mock in Beijing and Thomas Warrick in Washington. Thanks very much for being on the Newsmakers. And thank you for watching. As always, you can follow us on social media and be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Hazem Sika. We'll see you next time.